So today we're very happy to welcome Brian Kim from the University of Pennsylvania. And Brian's title is Cultivating the Reader in Late 19th Century Russia. And I will be the собеседник. But for now, please excuse me if I need to turn off my camera because of bad internet issues, but I'm right here. And Brian, take it away. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Anne. And thank you to Sasha and everyone at the Jordan Center and to the organizers of 19V as a whole, as we now continue into the second year of the initiative. I'm very happy to be beamed onto your screens today and looking forward to your comments, Anne, as well as hearing from this wonderful collective. Wait, I need to share my screen. I forgot about that. All right, so here we are. So in beginning to approach the topic of the cultivation of the reader in late 19th century Russia, I'd first like to dwell briefly on the phenomenon of the list of recommended books for reading. Lists like these are commonplace nowadays, of course, whether they're compiled by various literary organizations and publishing houses around the world, or reported in the form of the bestsellers list, or curated in listicle format by an enthusiast on the internet, or indeed baked into the great books courses on some of our own campuses. Whatever the form these lists may take, it's worth thinking briefly about how these lists are put together, for whom, by whom, and to what ends. The recommendations that one finds on sites such as Goodreads, just to name one example, are primarily indicators of popularity, of course with some exceptions. Lists of bestsellers would also reflect this dynamic, although with the caveat that in that case, there are really explicit market forces behind their creation. Still other lists might be geared toward people who want to dive deep into a certain genre, the best of sci-fi, the best of the classics, the best beach reads, or those who wish to find a community of fellow readers or promote a certain community of writers, or immerse themselves in the literature of, say, Ireland before taking a trip there, or improve a certain aspect of their lives, or indeed their whole person, etc., etc., etc. The list of lists, of course, goes on, but this brief and incomplete enumeration on my part should be more than enough to see that there is a common assumption that underlies any such list, and that is that there are benefits that reading can confer upon the reader, and that these benefits can be unlocked through the reading of a specific set of texts. For the purposes of my talk today, the most relevant subcategory of this genre is the Great Books list, which in the form I have in mind is something that can be traced back to 1886, put together in England by Sir John Lubbock and published as part of a volume entitled The Pleasures of Life. Aside from adding an explicitly evaluative quality to an already long-standing trend of drawing up book lists of various sorts in England, Lubbock's list of 100 books deemed best worth reading quickly inspired counterparts elsewhere, first in Germany and France, and then in Russia. This Russian counterpart was the personal project of the publisher Mikhail Vederle, who sought to create a definitive version of lists like Lubbock's for his own compatriots. Its story involves a slightly better known figure, one who looms large in any discussion of reading and education in late 19th century Russia, among other topics, Leo Tolstoy. By 1890, when Vederle approached Tolstoy with a request to provide his own list of the best 100 books, Tolstoy's renown had long since reached international proportions, and it was reasonable that he would stand out among the many voices that comprised Russia's literary pedagogical scene as the one person whose recommendations would garner the greatest possible interest among the reading public. So it was that Vederle singled Tolstoy out with the thoughtfulness of a handwritten note appended to a circular, entreating the great author to provide what would surely be the pièce de résistance of the volume that surfaced in 1895 as Мнения русских людей о лучших книгах для чтения, opinions of Russian people on the best books for reading, that you see in the middle of your screen right now. Though Tolstoy, along with nearly 2,000 others whom Vederle had approached a little less personally, ultimately refused this request, citing among other things lack of time and desire, he did have the courtesy to respond to the publisher, though it was about a year later, And as part of that response, he also made a single abortive attempt to formulate a list of the texts that he judged to have had the greatest influence on his own development. I will return to this list in due course, but for now I will say that my main interest in it, beyond what it might tell us about Tolstoy, lies in the way that this list can be understood in the context of its historical moment and embedded into a general social tendency that was newly preoccupied with catering and administering to the needs, real or perceived, of a nascent Russian reading public. Though it was never finished or even published, Tolstoy's list of recommended reading fits the mold of the cultural imperative among Russia's literary and pedagogical circles to inculcate new and potential readers with a sense of how they ought to approach, select, and engage with their reading material. That is, to develop in Russia's reading public a sense of good readerly taste that could then be channeled into the promotion of their continued development, whether moral, spiritual, or intellectual. As I will show, these were not new issues per se, but ones that took on a renewed sense of importance in light of the growing and diversifying population of readers in Russia in the second half of the 19th century. I will first offer a short overview of how earlier thinkers, including Nikolai Karanzin and Vissarion Belinsky, conceived of the role of reading in the development of the individual, and how they helped to set the initial parameters of the discourse surrounding this question, which would evolve alongside the demographics of the Russian readership over the course of the century. What begins to emerge from this genealogy is a number of figures who together come to make up what we might call the reader's ecosystem. What I mean by this is that we are well accustomed to thinking of the reader and the author and the relationship between them. But when we turn our attention to reading as a social phenomenon, it becomes clear that there are in fact a number of other important dramatis personae here, including critics, educators, librarians, booksellers, and others who have been tasked in various ways with the curation of reading material for the masses. In my talk today, then, I would like to visit some representatives of these categories, including Tolstoy, Literate, and Nikolai Rubakin, and examine how they conceived of the preparation, motivations, and psychology of the reader, how each thought the reader ought to be cultivated, what responsibilities lay with the various gatekeepers, and what rights individuals had or ought to have or not have in making their own choices vis-a-vis reading. The question at the heart of all this can in fact be phrased very simply. When it comes to deciding what and how to read, who should get to make the decisions and what gives them the right to do so? At the center of the multiplicity of opinions concerning the idea of directing the reading activities of others, I argue that there lay an ethical question, one that pitted individual freedom against an often top-down idea of progress that extrapolated from the development of the individual to that of society as a whole. One starting point for this discussion lies in Nikolai Karanzin's commentary at the outset of the 19th century. In a pair of essays written in 1802 on the book trade and the love of reading in Russia, and why is there so little writing talent in Russia, Karanzin assesses the current state of the Russian world of letters and its participants, and he lays out a basic configuration that we know well, one in which Russia might currently lag a little behind Western Europe in terms of the development of a national literature and the public's relationship to it, but is poised to come into its own in this regard at an undetermined point sometime in the foreseeable future. In this way, Karamzin's appraisal of the love of reading in Russia is optimistic indeed, though he admits that, quote, we are only beginning to love reading, end quote. He also notes that, quote, hardly in any other country has the number of those interested in reading increased so quickly as in Russia, end quote, making fertile ground for a burgeoning culture of reading that is only starting to take root. In other words, though the state of the Russian book market as such in 1802 is yet poor, and the state of the reading public is commensurate to it, reading in Russia is on the ascendant, and Karamzin could not be happier. There is admittedly something a little hyperbolic about that statement, but the main point I wish to make here is this. Karamzin really wants people to read. He tells us himself, I do not know about others, but I am happy so long as people read. In this, he is a sentimentalist par excellence. He has a strong belief in the capacity of the novel in particular to speak to the greatest potential swath of readers and draw them to books through their depictions of the range of human emotions, thereby connecting with them and unlocking their capacity to expand their horizons in important ways. After all, not everyone is capable of engaging with philosophy or history or science, but everyone can recognize themselves, situations they've lived through, and emotions they've experienced in stories. So goes the theory. And Karamzin underlines that, quote, the most mediocre novels, even those written without any talent, contribute in some way to enlightenment, end quote. The reading material as such, then, does not really seem to matter for him. As long as people are reading, they have begun to do a little something for themselves in terms of their moral and intellectual development. The moral aspect here takes greater emphasis for Karamzin, and part and parcel of his belief in the salutary nature of reading per se is his attendant trust in the reader's ability to be able to distinguish between what is worthy of moral emulation and what is not. Our moral nature, he contends, is such that the heart is not satisfied by the depiction of bad people and will never make them its favorites. The idea is that the reader is not wired this way. We will naturally take what is good and apply it to ourselves. In fact, because of the mechanisms at play, he claims that, quote, bad people do not even read novels, end quote. It's a very optimistic view that Karamzin presents overall, both of the future of Russia's book market and of the inclination to goodness that is inherent in people's moral nature, which here translates to a steadfast belief in the individual's readiness to make use of reading in the ways that would be most conducive to their development, their ability not to be led astray. Lest this sound too simplistic, I also want to draw attention to a couple of assumptions that are embedded in Karamzin's expressions of trust in the reader's inherent morality. These assumptions are ones that get carried over and perhaps amplified in the thinking of others later in the century. For one, Karamzin identifies an edifying consequence in the majority of novels that opens at least the oblique possibility of the role that reading can play in an individual's education. All pleasurable reading, he reminds us, influences the mind, without which neither can the heart feel nor the imagination conceive. Books provide a certain kind of education in both their form and their content. The way they have been written and organized offer models for emulation in the use of language and thinking, and their narratives often showcase positive models of virtuous behavior or negative models of its opposite, to say nothing of the wealth of details and general information with which books, even bad ones, are replete. The other aspect that goes hand in hand with the possibility of education is that of a certain articulation on Karamzin's part of the rhetorical configuration of reading. Here I have in mind the author and the reader to which I alluded earlier. As you can see on the slide, Karamzin places the author and the reader on different rungs of what he calls the ladder of intellectual development. The author thus emerges as one of the first gatekeepers of the reader's ecosystem, an entity whose essence is defined by their level of talent, which presumably separates them from the reader on the lower rung of intellectual development, and may grant them a certain authority to exert their influence from on high. This talent for Karamzin is something that authors have in their very nature, good ones at least, even if it cannot achieve its full potential without patience and hard work. Quote, the author must possess not only what we call a gift, that is, some sort of special faculty derived from his spiritual capacities, but also much historical information, a mind educated in logic, fine taste, and a knowledge of society, the acquisition of all of which requires effort and training. Presumably, all of these, with the exception perhaps of a natural gift, are things that a reader can acquire too. But until such time as a reader does, it is authors with their talents who are called in their work to do things like, quote, help their compatriots to think and speak better, end quote, thereby effecting an education of the masses on a broad general level. In the meantime, though, Karamzin is happy to leave readers free to make their own choices regarding what to read, so long as they do so, even as he acknowledges the existence of those with talent who know better, are in fact explicitly tasked with providing a positive influence on moral and intellectual development. In this way, Karanzin's commentary constitutes a basic starting point for the question of the cultivation of the reader, as he opens up questions of the reader's education, as well as of the reader's agency or ability to make their own decisions. Halfway through the century, Vissarion Belinsky takes up similar questions in a number of writings, though I will focus here primarily on his 1846 article, Thoughts and Notes on Russian Literature. Although nearly 50 years has passed, on the surface, not too much seems to have changed as far as the basic configuration that we know well is concerned. Belinsky still conceives of Russia's respective level of development versus that of Western Europe, and on the heels of Pushkin, Gogol, and Lermontov, he is still predicting an impending efflorescence of Russian letters that Karanzin had also foreseen. Nevertheless, in some aspects, this process is already underway. Belinsky repudiates the idea that people do not buy books in Russia, citing multiple printings of books that he considers to be outstanding, to say nothing of those which are quite ordinary. However, he does take publishers and booksellers to task for the high prices of books, asking how the book trade can be expected to flourish when so many of its offerings are beyond the financial reach of the general public. He draws attention in this way to another set of the reader's gatekeepers, those who are responsible for the dissemination of books as commodities and should take efforts to ensure that their asking prices are commensurate with the demands of the public. To come back to the questions of education and agency, though, Belinsky's main contribution to the reader's ecosystem is in his articulation of the figure of the critic. The critic's mission, in Belinsky's view, as Anne Lounsbery has argued, is educational. Quote, because of his bleak assessment of his countrymen's level of literary culture, Belinsky's primary goal was to develop these readers' capacity for discernment, their ability to distinguish good from bad or bad from worse, end quote. Therefore, whereas Karanzin discusses education's relation to literature somewhat obliquely, Belinsky connects them explicitly and importantly, to the point of outright equating the progress of society's education with the progress of our literature, for our education is the direct effect of our literature upon the ideas and morals of society. As one might expect of Belinsky, there is a democratizing tendency that is palpable throughout his commentary on education in particular. Education, according to him, is what makes people equal, and the critic's job is to cultivate the reader's ability to discern. Whereas Karanzin trusts in the reader's innate ability to exercise this faculty of discernment, Belinsky recognizes that we are not all of us necessarily born with this capacity built in, and that the hard work that Karanzin imputed to the development of his category of talent must in fact also take place on the part of the reader. It follows then that for Belinsky, not all reading is good reading. Quote, it is better to have nothing at all, he proclaims, than a great deal of nonsense, end quote. And yet, in acknowledging and describing the need for literary education, Belinsky also does a little more than Karanzin to demarcate the boundaries between the common reader and those who know better. This can be seen in his division of the population into a hierarchy of genius, talent, and the masses, that is, geni, talanti, толпа, based on the degree to which they are able to remain independent in their thought. As far as the question of cultivating the reader is concerned, the most relevant of these groups is the last one, to which the vast majority belong, and this is on the screen right now. The mass, for the most part, consists of such people without opinions, and it is always and everywhere directed by people with more or less independent opinions. And here is the reason why the mass does not long fancy the false and ugly, but sooner or later always recognizes the worth of the true and beautiful. Others act for it, and it merely obeys. Without this moral discipline, there would be no unity in people's ideas, and a terrible anarchy would reign. Unlike Karanzin, who attributes this recognition of the worth of the true and beautiful to something that lies naturally within us, Belinsky contends that for the masses, this is an ability that comes from without, a necessary form of moral discipline dispensed by those who know better. Again, this is the role of the critic, which is to say, of course, himself, in whose goodwill and ability to direct the opinions of the masses away from fearsome anarchy Belinsky places his trust. As we approach the second half of the century then, the task regarding the Russian reading public appears no longer to be so simple a matter as getting books in people's hands and expecting or hoping for the best. Unlike Karanzin, Belinsky insists that readers need guidance and cannot be left to their own devices. It is the role of the critic to provide this guidance and to help shape the course of the masses' ongoing encounter with literature. So, when we do turn our attention to the latter half of the century, this focus on making the right decision vis-a-vis reading, this environment in which lists of book recommendations take on a newly urgent significance, this focus can be attributed to the rapidly changing landscape of Russia's reading public, the workings of which Avram Breitblatt has described in detail. Breitblatt suggests that literacy is by and large an urban phenomenon that spreads most quickly when reading is undertaken, quote, for the satisfaction of one's spiritual demands and needs, end quote. For this to be true of a greater proportion of the population, the acquisition of new skills and habits must take place over time through the medium of a standardized literary language that provides a common language for diverse populations in contact. Reading was initially perceived as an activity with upper-class connotations that owed its proliferation in large part to the, quote, gradual appropriation of examples of upper-class behavior by the lower classes, end quote. The spread of literacy was thus accompanied by an increase in the movement of people and goods from rural to urban areas, particularly because cities were a space where different social classes could come into regular contact. From the 1860s to the 1890s, the number of temporary passports authorizing movement between the country and the city increased by a factor of 5, attesting to greater ease of mobility within the empire, alongside the development of the Russian railway network during this time. Moreover, the doubling of the urban population in European Russia from 6 to 12 million between 1863 and 1897 took place in tandem with a boom in higher education, a fourfold increase in the number of students in tertiary schools between 1861 and 1900, and a corresponding rise in the literacy rate from approximately 8% to 17%. In other words, allowing for some variation brought about by a relative lack of available figures for rural areas in this instance, we can infer that the population of readers approximately quadrupled during this time. At the beginning of the century, this number was less than 5%. So though these numbers that rise to 17% admittedly look to be on the smaller side from our modern perspective, they still had a destabilizing effect on the traditional order of social classes, which Breitblatt contends, quote, led to the destruction of the old worldview, and people strove to find new paradigms for their own existence, end quote. Reading thus emerged, albeit slowly, as a way to explore the parameters of this new society for a greater and more diverse population than ever before. And the book, in particular, came to be seen as an indispensable aid in spiritual and moral self-improvement for those who sought it. To return now to the lists of recommended reading with which I began, the context I've just described is the one in which people like Literate took it upon themselves to provide some guidance to these throngs of people who were turning to books to understand their place in the world. Like Belinsky, Literate fits the mold of a critic who follows a pedagogical imperative. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the language of the circular through which he first approached the 2,000 leaders in pedagogical thought with his request for recommendations. The lay of the land attested by Breitblatt emerges here as the immense proliferation of literature in quantity among a population that reads quite a lot, but in chaotic and unproductive fashion. Extremely bad texts that do not merely fall short of the task of serving education, but in fact facilitate the proliferation of the most ridiculous ideas. Putting the lie to, for example, Karanzin's assumption that the act of reading alone would bring about moral and intellectual development without regard to the nature of what was being read. Though I obviously haven't reproduced the whole circular here, Lederle's request is repeatedly couched in the language of promoting good education and upbringing and the development of upstanding moral and intellectual character among the youth and the reading public, as the paramount task that now faces not only the Russian nation, but all of humanity. In a word, his main concern of guiding the Russian reading public to worthy texts is one that responds to the precarious state of burgeoning literacy in Russia that must be put to the best possible use. Like Karanzin and Belinsky before him, he draws an explicit comparison to the state of reading and education in other parts of Europe, in this case, England, France, and Germany, where efforts to narrow down the selection of good texts for reading, like his own, have already taken place. In this case, the role of a critic is once again that of a guide for those who might not otherwise know how to make the best choices for themselves. When Tolstoy responded to this endeavor, Lederle probably thought, you win some, you lose some. The latter half of that statement is easily addressed. Tolstoy did not grant Lederle permission to publish what he sent him. And indeed, Tolstoy's recommendations do not form part of the volume that came out in 1895. But the former half is comprised of the fact that Tolstoy not only sent along an attempt at a list, but also categorized his chosen works by the period of one's life when they ought to be read, and rated them according to the influence each had had on his own thought, on a scale of huge, very large, and large, огромное, очень большое и большое, thereby creating not just a list of recommendations, but the skeleton of a reading program with built-in stages of progression. Here is the list in its entirety, which I've reproduced here along with Tolstoy's little errors and inconsistencies. This incomplete list of fewer than 50 titles came at the end of a letter in which Tolstoy took some issue with Lubbock's methodology, back in England, that is. He voiced serious interest in Lederle's undertaking, but ultimately expressed his inability to comply fully with the request for a number of reasons. There was a lack of time and desire, as I mentioned earlier, but also the task itself had too many variables as far as Tolstoy was concerned. And in any case, Tolstoy claimed that he could not remember all at once everything that he would consider worthy of his recommendation. And even this half list was one that he added to only little by little as individual texts would flit into his memory. And even that happened somewhat imperfectly, as you can see, for example, in the entry pointing to Feuerbach on the bottom right in the middle of the section from 50 to 63. Generally speaking, the works that did make it onto Tolstoy's list come as little surprise. Certainly, the list is an expression of Tolstoy's own reflections concerning the texts he considered to have been important in his own experience of reading up to the age of 63, which is how old he was when he compiled it. Most, if not all, of the entries find very clear reflection throughout Tolstoy's other writings. They range from religious texts and classical epics to contemporary philosophy and Russian literature, for the most part, corresponding to what one might expect of a well-read cosmopolitan individual of the late 19th century, with a strong focus on writings conducive to the development of moral and spiritual education that became his main preoccupation in the latter period of his life. Looking at even the scant dozen entries that have merited the designation of huge influence gives an effective sense of things, and these are the ones I've taken the liberty of highlighting in yellow. 3 of them are devoted to the Bible, with different portions corresponding to various points of life: the story of Joseph from early childhood, the Gospel of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount in particular from teenage years, and the entirety of the Gospels in the original Greek from middle age. Russian Byliny and folk tales also figure from the earliest period. From his teenage years, we receive the recommendations of Rousseau, Dickens, and Gogol. Somewhat curiously, nothing between the ages of 20 and 35, just Victor Hugo between 35 and 50, and in later years, a series of texts devoted to philosophy and religion, including Pascal and Epictetus, as well as Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching and the Lalitavistara Sutra in French translation, which is what the entry on Abuja refers to. In this way, we can trace an obvious commonality between Tolstoy's recommendations for Lederle and his own personal history of reading. A comparison of Tolstoy's list to the one that Lederle ultimately published, that is, of texts that had appeared in the recommendations of 8 or more of the people he had approached, reveals much common ground. The shared territory includes the Bible, Rousseau, Gogol, Dickens, and Hugo as representatives of huge influence to Tolstoy, and they are joined by Pushkin, Schiller, Turgenev, Lermontov, Goethe, and Homer, all of whom have merited Tolstoy's designation of very large influence. This is an overlap indicative, again, of a generally cosmopolitan reading program one might find among well-educated Russians of this period. However, the fact that Tolstoy has categorized his texts into appropriate groupings by age gives his list the possible function, whether intentional or not, of an educational program that can be followed, rather than Literale's more general list of recommendations. Thus, in their own ways, both participate in a late 19th century Russian discourse on the need for salutary reading material drawn from a wide variety of sources. I'll note Literale's final summation of the number of Russian versus foreign writers, which is in keeping with the focus so many of these figures had on the relative state of Russian versus European letters. Whereas Literale's survey does not go beyond Europe, the very end of Tolstoy's list does, signaling the beginnings of an expansion in terms of where good books can come from, a more expansive conception of good readerly taste. To that point, also taking place at the turn of the 20th century was a renewed focus on increasing the number and range of valuable texts that would be readily accessible to the Russian reading public. This is attested by the emergence of a bibliography of belletristic literature in Russian translation. The foreword to this 1897 publication was provided by the scholar of reading practices Nikolai Rubakin, who discusses the place of translations in the works available to the Russian reader. It is not difficult to see that our translated literature does not merely fail to impress with its abundance, but that its state is rather positively poor, that it even impresses with its paucity. It is characterized by the glaring absence of translations of a long line of distinguished works that decorate the canon of world literature. Suffice it to say that we lack translations of Rabelais, Montaigne, Keats, Leconte de Lisle, and Johnson, to say nothing of such works as the Zendavesta, the Vedas, the Ramayana, etc., etc. The poverty of our translated literature gives rise only to the desire that it be enriched with new translations, and not that new impediments to this enrichment arise. Rubakin's impassioned defense of translated literature is remarkable for its acknowledgement of world literature at a time when the Russian literary scene had by now produced the likes of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and other authors whose works were widely read and appreciated not only in Russia, but also beyond its borders. Rather than insist on a sort of literary nationalism, however, he encourages the continued importation of literature from abroad, and on a grander scale yet, as the conception of the world has now expanded to include areas beyond Europe, and the texts to which Russians ought to have access had expanded accordingly. Rubakin's main concern, like those of Tolstoy and Literale, was that the rapidly burgeoning literate population be guided from popular literature to worthier works, and in this and other writings, he tended to direct his own recommendations not necessarily to individual readers directly, so much as to the librarians and booksellers who could furnish the masses with appropriate reading material. In his view, the positive direction of the reading activities of others would be best accomplished by exposing the populace to as many ideas as possible from all the world over. The example of Tolstoy's inclusion of what he considered the hugely influential Tao Te Ching and the Lalita Vistara Sutra would seem to corroborate this notion, as even the great Tolstoy was able to access these texts only in French translation. Rubakin's foreword also points to the chasm between the ideal educative function of expanding the availability of viable reading material and the stark realities of reading habits and learning practices. He writes, quote, "Everyone with an interest in the development of the society in which they live will desire above all that the various strata of the reading public absorb as much knowledge as possible, as much diverse knowledge as possible, that pertains to various conditions of private and public life in other countries and of other social classes. A general increase in material for critical thought, whether these materials are presented in the artistic images of a poet or in the steadfast words of a social commentator or public figure," end quote. So once again, we have this idea of expanding the capacities of education through expanding both the range and the availability of literature. The concerns identified by Literate and Rubakin echo throughout the pedagogical theoretical writings from this time period. I've been pointing to some of their remarks on reading in Russia to demonstrate that the question of readers' education was a current and ongoing conversation that took on particular and renewed significance during the 1880s and 1890s. However, Tolstoy is someone who had been thinking about these questions for much longer. And in the last part of my talk, I'd like to consider how Tolstoy approached the cultivation of the reader as an educational problem. Reading emerges as one of the fundamental characteristics of the distinction between education from life versus education from school that Tolstoy had articulated nearly 30 years earlier in his 1862 article on popular education in the inaugural issue of the pedagogical journal Yasnaya Polyana. For Tolstoy, the mechanical acquisition of the skill of literacy may be one that is made available through education from school. But the inclination to pursue reading of one's own accord and the ability to best select what to read from an ever-growing flood of texts are features that pertain to education from life. One of his main arguments against the deleterious influence of compulsory schooling, aside from the fundamental unfreedom that made it antithetical to the principle of liberty that informed his approach to pedagogy and the development of the individual, is that it deprives students of the desire to read, that they must espouse in order to benefit maximally from this second, more important variant of education from life. The other necessary condition, based on his observations during his travels in Western Europe and in France in particular, is that the book market achieve such a degree of robustness as to maximize exposure to the best texts and form a culture that valorizes reading and facilitates the possibility for each individual to take ownership of their own continuing self-education through that activity. In other words, while schooling is conceptualized as a means of mechanizing a new reader's path to being able to effect an ongoing education for the self, Tolstoy's orientation toward this kind of guidance is one of cultivation rather than mechanization, of catering to the needs and desires of the individual reader rather than promulgating a one-size-fits-all approach from the top down. He is most concerned with discovering a kind of education that students will partake of willingly. In this way, his list of recommendations resonates with Rayplat's identification of the book as a tool for spiritual and moral self-improvement, Literale's preoccupation with the development of upstanding moral and intellectual character, and Rubakin's emphasis on making available as much diverse knowledge as possible through the printed word. As was the case for both Karanzin and Belinsky, there is still a certain hierarchy that persists in Tolstoy's thought as well, inasmuch as he speaks of the responsibilities of the educating class before the classes which receive the education, and likens the relationship between the author and the reader to that between the school and the pupils, the state and the people, the mother and the child. But in Tolstoy's approach to teaching the people to read, to the question of who should get to decide what and how others read, we can observe an intersection of some of the ideological currents I've described today, one that acknowledges the importance of both the directive role of the critic and the decisive agency of the reader. Tolstoy's reluctance to follow through in the end with a whole list of reading recommendations might make some sense then in the context of the continually evolving orientation toward the book and its role in education in Russian culture. It is of course not the case that we have any reason to suspect that writing for the public is what dissuaded Tolstoy from finishing this list, as there are countless examples to the contrary. Certainly he understood what he was being asked to do as making an educational pronouncement. And these are the reasons for which he also took issue with the initial publication of Lubbock's list. Lubbock often names only authors and not their specific works, even when they have been most prolific, and he does not pay heed to individual circumstances. He makes no attempt to delineate which works of literature would be most productive for which types of people to read, in categories that Tolstoy identifies including age, education level, and individual character. And of course, Tolstoy considers this to be essential in making any recommendations of this sort. Indeed, for Tolstoy, there is a paramount importance in tailoring education of any sort to the circumstances peculiar to each individual. And the act of recommending, of teaching, from a prescriptive position thus presents an ethical quandary with which any educator must grapple. There is thus a somewhat paradoxical equilibrium, he maintains, between making use of his platform to make pronouncements on this subject and a deep sense of humility regarding the task of the teacher, that informs a tension between the rather tentative existence of his list of recommendations versus a certain apprehension on his part vis-a-vis the act of recommending itself. Adding to this in this case was the special pressure from Lederle, who all but ensured Tolstoy that his recommendations would be the main attraction of the Mnyenya volume. Though Tolstoy's list ultimately never became part of his public recommendations for reading, we can discern in it a reaffirmation of the texts that formed part of his own intellectual and spiritual development, a reflection of the ongoing concern of developing in Russia's reading public a sense of good readerly taste, which of course was itself continuing to develop, and perhaps even a commentary on how people of letters ought to respond to the changing needs of a Russian reading public that had reached a point where it could exercise agency, for better or for worse, in selecting its own reading material. Thank you very much.
Brian, thank you very much for that interesting talk. And now I'm going to introduce myself as Собеседник. I'm Anne Lounsbery from NYU, and I'm very happy to have the chance to say a few words about this paper. My remarks will be very brief because I'm sure that other people have a lot to say as well. First of all, can everybody hear me okay? I'm in a strange internet situation. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so first off, we're dealing with a really long time period here, right? We're dealing not just with a century, but with a century that packed in, seemingly several centuries worth of development and transformation. I mean, between Karanzin and Tolstoy, wow, you're talking about a lot of change. But we still see some patterns recurring in elites' responses to popular reading. And I would say those tensions include, do you want to expose readers to many texts and ideas, or do you want to protect them from texts and ideas? Do you want to let them make their own choices, or do you want to guide them in these choices? I would add another tension that's not mentioned here, but is certainly evident in the 1830s and will become acute again in the, say, 1890s with thinkers like Merezhkovsky. And that is prioritizing the development of readers, right, versus protecting the development of Russian literature, both authors and institutions, from the influence of less sophisticated readers. Because there's also quite a bit of anxiety in the 1830s. And again, I would guess, like, starting with Merezhkovsky or so, 1890s, about what is the effect of all of these kind of, unsophisticated readers on what we're going to start calling Russian literature, right? And the development of institutions. And some of these tensions that I mentioned exist even, say, within Belinsky's own oeuvre, right? So in 1836, he says that readers should be exposed to as many texts as possible so that they can learn to judge, just let them read. And then by 1847, as you point out, he says, better to read nothing at all than to read a lot of nonsense. So people who have spent more time than I have tracing Belinsky's own trajectory will probably point out these junctures, right? These points where he has actually very different assessments of the reading public and what it needs or what we should allow it. Basically, and this again applies to I think everyone who was thinking about readership in the 19th century, as soon as you have larger scale, that's when you're going to see a need for guidance and for the inculcation of standards, right? It's not a problem for Karanzin. You're talking about teeny print runs, right? You're talking about, there are people here who would know the numbers better than I do, like Bala Grigorian, for example, but you're talking about hundreds, right? And even in 1842, Dead Souls, which is the most anticipated text ever to come out in Russian, I think the print run was 1,200, right? So you're talking about these little tiny numbers. It's already in Gogol's time, they're starting to get worried about the development and inculcation of standards, but it's not a problem for Karanzin. So yes, and that goes along with his sort of sentimentalist hopefulness that all will be well because everybody has a good heart. Well, that hasn't really been tested yet, right? That gets tested when you get a lot of people reading and some of them aren't reading the way you want them to read. The other thing that happens when you start to have this increase in scale is that the incoherence and the mottliness of the texts that are coming out, that becomes very evident to elites, and they start to worry about the fact that, you know, it's just a big jumble, and how is anyone supposed to be able to deal with that? So the one thing I would suggest for the part of the paper that thinks about the first part of the century is maybe pay attention to some of the thinkers, especially between Karanzin and Belinsky, or around that time, who were very much not optimistic about readers' capacities, and who were worried about the effect of all of these uneducated people on literary development, right? Because there are plenty of people who thought that the need for guidance and even an authoritarian kind of approach to reading was, you know, what they wanted to see. Okay, so then I'll just speak very briefly about Tolstoy as what you talked about at the end of the paper. It's really interesting, I think, the tension you point out in Tolstoy between freedom and guidance. Yeah, I think Tolstoy wants to think that he loves freedom, but you know, that sort of controlling authoritarian impulse comes back. I think he loves freedom in theory, but when it comes to freedom in practice, I think he has a hard time with it. And I think about that in connection to the date when he's asked for this list. This is 1891, right? When he's asked to make this list. So that's around the same time as Kreutzer Sonata, and about, you know, less than a decade before What is Art. And both Kreutzer Sonata and What is Art are texts that are very, very worried about proliferation of texts. I think that I will just say one thing, that the late Tolstoy was very concerned with the problem of proliferation. Too many texts, too many readers, too much food, too much sex, too much fashion. And it would be interesting to connect that to his thoughts about reading. And then because I'm going to pass it back to Brian. I hope that you've been able to hear me. Thank you, and I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for your comments, and I'm sorry I will probably not be responding to a good chunk of them just because of the technical difficulties. But basically, I mean, everything that you've said in response to this paper, I pretty much agree with. It is, first of all, an extremely, it's a giant length of time. And I hope that I've been able to sort of scratch the surface of some of these dynamics, but you're absolutely right, of course, that there have been, you know, even less optimistic opinions concerning the direction of Russian letters in the reading public and whatnot, that I think do come up in precisely those times that you mentioned, the 1830s and the 1890s in particular. And one thing that I didn't really talk about all that much in this paper, but is of course very closely related, is, well, I suppose I did mention it a few times actually, but the sort of comparison between Russia and what is going on in Western Europe, this constant sense of being behind, that then sort of takes on an additional aspect of preoccupation with the presentation of what Russian literature is to foreign audiences too. So I think we get those two, the interaction between those two things. Belinsky's already talking about, but by the end of the century, we really start seeing quite a bit of concern about the sort of reputation of Russian literature abroad, or just among non-Russians in general. Let's see here, expose or protect. I mean, that is basically the sort of fundamental dynamic that I've tried to explore here. And I think it is quite interesting that Belinsky himself sort of embodies a vacillation from one point to the next, in a way that I think we also sort of see in Tolstoy, to respond a little bit to the end of your comments, where these people also seem to relate to the question of how to deal with all of these new readers. How should we do reading? in different ways at various points of their own thinking. So I don't mean to suggest that Belinsky, Tolstoy, even Karanzin were static in their thinking about this, rather that I've tried to use them as sort of little snapshots that are emblematic or representative of the general attitudes that we see sort of over the course of the century as they develop and have their ebbs and flows. Let me see here. I think perhaps that might be enough from me for the moment. I'm not sure if I've managed to respond to everything successfully, but yeah, thank you again, Anne, if you're here.
Can you hear me? I'm gonna take over for Anne at this moment, who sends her apologies. So yeah, thank you again, Brian, for the talk, and thank you, Anne, for your comments. And we're now taking questions from the floor.
Thanks. Hi, Brian.
Hi,
Anne. Thank you so much for this really stimulating talk. So I have sort of thoughts in three areas, some of which I think follow up on some of Anne's points as well. The first area in which I have some thoughts, I suppose, is this unfortunately proverbial question of terminology, and the even more unfortunately proverbial question of singular versus plural in speaking about the public. It seems to me that when you speak about the public, and I'm by no means criticizing your choice of the singular, I'm just thinking aloud in hopes that this might, help get us somewhere. So in discussing the public in the singular, I think we imagine it as continuous, unified, and also possible to shape, possible to direct, possible to alter as a singular entity. But I want to, I guess, think a little bit more about the fact that even in my own sort of limited frame of reference, since the early modern period in Russia, there existed multiple reading communities with some degree of overlap among them, but also some degree of significant separation and distance, reading communities that dealt in manuscript texts primarily, and you can have different manuscript text reading communities, right, all the way through to the, really through the end of the 19th century even. You have reading, well, the other thing is the difference between community and public, because I think public has certain political meanings, at least for me, that immediately take me to people like Habermas, whereas a reading community is a different thing and maybe more historically grounded. And so I'm just thinking about the fact that during the period you're looking at, there are also communities with different levels of literacy, different kinds of interests. And so, for example, in Как Pushkin вышел в гений, Abraham Rietveld writes about, like, he has this list of books published in the second quarter of the first half of the 19th century, twice or many, many more times than twice, right? And what comes through that list is that there was probably a real market for really lowbrow things like сказки of various sorts, but сказка not in the current sense, but more in chivalric romance, kind of contaminated genre sense. But not so much for, let's say, the kinds of novels that Karanzin wanted people to read, right? Because Karanzin doesn't even want people to read Nicanor. Read it, but it's not the best kind of book to read. So then this question of thinking about publics as multiple, disorganized, disconnected, sometimes not mutually intelligible even, I'm wondering kind of what you might do with it, because I think this also maps onto reader versus readers. Right? Is there a kind of representative reader? Personally, I don't know that I would want to make a claim for a representative reader, but actually it might make sense if Tolstoy imagines one, then that's a different matter. The second kind of area in which I had thoughts and questions has to do with economics and the economics of the publishing market. It seems to me that some of the things you're describing could be seen as prompted by multiple circumstances, ranging from, I think you're absolutely right, literary movement and the sensibility that attends it, like sentimentalism, but also just the size of the print market for various types of books. So with that in mind, it seems as though, and this is kind of echoing Anne's point, the more books there are, the more reason there is to worry that people will read it incorrectly. I don't know whether you would say that the evidence bears that out, but that's a possibility I'd invite you to consider. In terms of like this genealogy that you're establishing, moving from Karanzin onward, I would add Bulgarian from 1826, writing about different types of readers in a note to the third section, because he has like a pretty specific breakdown of, I think, 4 types of publics. And he does kind of see them as kind of separate publics, and that might be interesting to add into your summary. And then the last thing I was hoping we might think together about is really something that occurred to me in the light of the rest of your work and what I've really enjoyed hearing over the last couple of years. I was wondering if, in the context of thinking about, the paper you presented today, you would want to speak and think more about books as things. And this kind of also, I think, follows up on the question that Anne was asking, because she got cut off by bad internet. Because Kreutzer Sonata, for example, right, is so much indeed about clothes, and it's actually pretty explicitly a text about industrial capitalism and consumerism and so forth. So does it help to think about the 1880s and 1890s anxieties that you're dealing with in explicit relation to like the status of material goods in Russian public discourse and the status of books as material goods? The other echo that I thought was really helpful that Anne underlined was the one between the 1820s and 30s and 1880s and 90s. These are both moments when high letters retreat into this kind of place of writing for the elite. While there is this kind of mass market in the 1880s and 90s, there are these big novels that nobody reads anymore, and the beginning of symbolism with the almanac, the kind of small scale publishing, right, kind of niche artisanal elite literary production. Same in the 1820s and 30s in a different way, but again, novels that nobody reads that sell well, and kind of elite publishing for a small group. So I guess in the context of that, again, like I think it makes a lot of sense to think about stuff we read as things, to think about them in connection with fashion, economics, and consumption. And especially given the rest of your work, I thought you would be really, really well placed to comment on that. And thank you again. This was a really stimulating talk. I enjoyed it a lot.
Oh, thank you so much, Bella. I just realized that I've been unmuted this whole time, so you've been probably hearing my pen on the desk. But anyway, all right. So let me see here. Terminology, singular versus plural. Absolutely. I mean, ordinarily, in fact, I do conceive of the reading publics in the plural. I think it would be, and this is also sort of concomitant with readers versus reader. I think it would be very difficult to pin down a single definition of a singular reader or a singular public that holds true even for any one of these figures, let alone across the entire 19th century. So I think that yes, it is necessary to acknowledge the fact that there are sort of these different pockets of people, groups of people, let's say. I need to think a lot more about the notion of community versus public, because that's actually not something that I've given much thought at all. But that there are different groups of people who approach reading in different ways, have their own small sort of subcultures at times, even during, I'm thinking of late 18th, early 19th century, where people would sort of get together and maybe one person would read, and everybody else who's gathered there is also sort of participating in a certain form of reading in that sense. I mean, from situations like that to the more sort of recognizable form of reading from a modern perspective, which is basically just one person buying a book and opening it and reading it by themselves, and everything sort of in between. I think there is only so much a sort of general theory of reading can do to encompass all of these potential groups. And that's before we even get to the difference between urban readers versus rural readers, and the sort of relative richness or poverty of various libraries scattered across the empire and this sort of thing. So, I mean, in a word, yes, absolutely, this should be a plural conception. Oh, but the market for low value things. And I think, Bella, you're sort of pointing to a fluctuation that we see sort of repeat itself throughout, right? There's a sort of tension between sort of high literature, writing for the elites versus a sort of mass market, lowbrow, stuff that our elites would poo-poo and in fact do. And I know Hilda Hovenboom is here. She has that wonderful article on sentimentalism in the book market, where I think that's a really good example of exactly this dynamic at work, where we have elites who are sort of personally invested in promoting themselves and making sure that their things are the things that are getting read, manipulating essentially the public's S apostrophe conception of these less worthy works, sort of creating that hierarchy even as they speak. As far as Karanzin is concerned, I think I would this is a very minor point, but I want to push back on this idea that Karanzin doesn't want you to read Nikanor. I think he does, if that's where you are. And he's sort of trusting in the process. Like, yes, you're at the Nikanor level and you're going to get something out of it, that's fine. But hopefully that will allow you to get to the Karanzin level later on. So I think he acknowledges a place for these less worthy works, even as he does have this hierarchy in mind of some works are worthier than others and some aren't. Economics, and I mean, I think I've sort of started, all of these topics sort of blend and flow into each other, of course, but the size of the print market and the idea that there being more books is occasion for more worry, I think absolutely. This flood of texts and just this glut of information, I think, I mean, if we think of the internet now, for example, that's sort of an immediate example that comes to mind, where one naturally has the sense of wanting to sort of corral and curate and make sense of all of the stuff that is out there. And one of the things that really attracts me to the late 19th century in particular is the fact that we are getting all of these texts in greater quantities than ever before. Not only are the things that are being produced in Russia being printed with greater print runs and whatnot, but we're also bringing in more and more things from abroad too. It's just a monumental sort of increase in everything. And I think it stands to reason that there would therefore be this impulse to sort of winnow down a little bit, even as I mentioned, there were people who welcomed this expansion and were like, more. So once again, I don't think that there is a sort of, I think it would be wrong to say that all of the people who are thinking about questions of readership are in agreement about whether expansion is better or not, but rather that these things, that these phenomena are sort of coexisting. Let me see here. Oh, books as things. And Kreutzer Sonata in particular. I'm always so fascinated actually by the fact that Kreutzer became viral, and to the point where it was actually made illegal to send in the US Post. Like, that is mind-boggling. If you look at it from the perspective of like, even 50 years earlier, that would never have happened. And it speaks to the greater mobility with which things and ideas are traveling around the world, are within Russia, beyond Russia, that we're now sort of dealing with an object that has itself sort of materially changed. I mean, if you just look at any book from the 18th century and compare it to one that came out 100 years later, the typeset is likely to be different, the kind of paper is going to be different. There's a sort of settling and what's the word here? Amalgamation of what used to be sort of different kinds of books or book-like things that then sort of become standardized and enter into not a single format necessarily, but I would be willing to wager that a person in 1900's conception, mental idea of a book is quite different from that of somebody in 1800. So I think tracing that, or tracing the attitudes that I've been looking into in relation to this changing perception of books as things, as well as their greater quantities and movement, would be really interesting to do. So thank you for that suggestion. I think that would be a really great place for me to go next.
We have a question from Ralph Dumaine. Did Rubakin's perspective or priorities change with his association with Lenin?
I mean, I think the short answer in general would be yes. But in terms of what he thought about reading and the availability of books and readership, etc. So this goes beyond the time period that I was talking about today, but Rubakin would go on to sort of make a case for really basing reading programs on the psychology of individual readers. And his sort of big statement to this effect, I suppose, would be the founding of the field of bibliopsychology and the creation of, or at least aiming towards the creation of reading programs that would be designated for various people depending on their psychological makeup, what kind of person they are, that would sort of help them along, not individualized necessarily, but sort of customized path of development. So in that sense, I don't think that Rubakin's opinions concerning expanding the availability of reading material changed tremendously, but I think he did come to articulate a more sort of, I almost hesitate to say constrained, but he came up with this program that people could follow and thereby sort of embodied some of the ideas concerning the critic and their responsibility to guide that I discussed.
Yes, thank you, Brian, for the great talk. I think it's a great talk and a fantastic topic. I think kind of the looking at literature from the perspective of readers is one of the ways in which we can make our specific knowledge about poetics and literary history part of the general conversation about society, right, and how society works. And so I think this is kind of one of the directions that we should really be moving into. And kind of following up on some of the things that Bella said, I think that kind of an interesting kind of methodology, right, that we already have for us is both Habermas and German reader reception theory, which basically kind of came up with the idea of an implied reader, which means that before we go and become sociologists, which is also a great thing for us to do, we also look at how the reader works as a category of the social imaginary, how it's imagined. And I think that a lot of the things that you showed today had to do with this, how writers imagine readers, right? And kind of, even before we start matching this to the sociological realities, right, we can look at what is going on and what are the concepts that we are using. And again, going back to questions that Bella mentioned, a central question here is the question of the individual, right? And because this has been a concept that was central to your talk, and it was absolutely central to your quotes, right? They think about Tolstoy specifically, right? They think about the reader as individual. But kind of my question here would be kind of whether, and in which way should we actually theorize this concept? What is an individual? How does it even work, right? Because intuitively it can be for us self-explanatory, right? But it's not. And if you look at Habermas specifically, who kind of, his idea of the bourgeois public sphere is built on the idea that, okay, at some point, the concept of a private individual is being invented, which sort of claims to be generally applicable, but it's not, because it is a household owner. So it's basically a class identity transposed into a fiction, right? Because obviously in real life, that's not how things actually work. But there is this utopia of which kind of makes the privacy, the individuality, a projection of a particular class setup, not just class identity. And the reading individual, specifically for Habermas, but for Jauss as well, becomes this point of negotiation, this construction where the mapping of class identities onto a consumption and production of text happens, right? So I think that the very kind of that, actually taking this whole idea of the individual apart is a very interesting direction in which I think your talk really points, and kind of you also mentioned how this is projected against, okay, the new masses, the numbers, the growing readership. So there is this tension which I think is inherent to not even to the whole problematic of literary history or sociology of literature, but actually to the understanding of text that we are dealing here, the text of reading, right? How is the whole idea of individuality a projection of social identities and social tensions, right? Because obviously when we talk about Tolstoy not being an actual level of freedom, or when we can talk about the writers being concerned with disciplining the masses, the reading habits of the masses. They shouldn't read it, they should read the right books in a right kind of way. There is a paternalistic dynamic, which is obviously not only limited to culture or reading, which is a kind of obviously one of the ways in which class relationship articulates itself, right? And the tensions, the anxieties, I'm sorry for what's happening outside my window. It's very loud. But the tensions, the anxieties that are connected with the class distinction, and obviously this is what Habermas shows, that once you have a private bourgeois sphere of the private individuals, what happens next is then the wild masses come in, and they're literate by that moment. That's mid 19th century, and the bourgeois public sphere, which saw itself as emancipatory and liberal, has to be conservative. It has to say, okay, so you are barbarians, you're reading the wrong kind of thing. And so there is a real dynamic there, which sort of undermines this, the perspective from which we're looking. Do we actually want to be looking at this from Tolstoy's perspective? And how do we actually understand Tolstoy's perspective? Because Tolstoy can also be different. Tolstoy also writes things, кому кого нужно учиться писать, right? This whole class dynamic is obviously one of his major anxieties, and then it's articulated differently in his different texts. And the last quote I'm gonna kind of mention is from Belinsky, I think it's from the Взгляд на литературу 47-го года, where he actually problematizes, I'm sorry, it's not an actual English word, he discusses this concept of the reader in the context of his defense of the natural school. So the natural school shows all those kind of lowly proletarian realities to the public of readers, right? And the reader, Belinsky, actually uses the French word bourgeois, spells it in French, is this person who sits at home and reads about all those poor people, and he isn't happy because he doesn't want to know anything about them. He wants to be happy, and he wants to know that he lives in a good social order, which is for Habermas the basic assumption behind the bourgeois public sphere. But he does not. So, and this is a private reader in the sense that he has his own private house. This is also a reader with a class identity, because the very position of individuality is a position of class dominance. But this reader for Belinsky is not his own position. It's not the position where the critic or the enlightened reader, the radical reader, should be looking at. This reader is the enemy. This reader is somebody who has to be criticized, taken apart, because the real social life is happening between the people portrayed by the natural school and the new readerships which read them, who actually belong to the same world. As Makar Devushkin says in Бедные люди, he comments on Gogol's Chanel and says, okay, so is this reader is this reader going to help me financially, you know? So things are happening outside of this individuality scheme, which I think is kind of inherent in the whole problematic. So yeah, I'm sorry, that was a long comment.
No, thank you so much for those rich insights, Kirill. I think my answer might be too short, but the one that I have in mind is that I think there is a central, inherent, as you put it, and really unresolvable tension between really any theorization of an individual versus any group of people. Because we can try to apply, I mean, Tolstoy would love to have the time to sit down with every, peasant child or whoever and, discover what it is that the peasant child wants and experiences and feels, and then, go through all of the things that are necessary to tailor the educational experience. And whatnot. This is, of course, in the article by the other one by Tolstoy that you mentioned. But there's an unresolvable tension, I think, between coming up with a program that can be individually applied and then extrapolating from that to apply it to more than one individual. Like there is going to be some sort of difference by definition, which isn't to say that, of course, you can't, theorize anything about how groups of people bigger than one work and how you should be dealing with them in directing the reading activities in this case. But I think this is one of the reasons why there is so much tension within each of these figures' thought, let alone among them, that there's only so much you can say about the individual before it starts sort of no longer being about the public, and vice versa. And it depends on how much emphasis you place on the individual. I mean, Tolstoy, I always say of late Tolstoy that he's really hard to work with and understand, because there are certain things that, late Tolstoy is allowed to say and not allowed to say, and he's very aware of all of this. So we kind of always need to be taking him with a grain of salt and thinking very critically about whether he 100% straightforwardly means what he says, or he's trying to present a certain image of himself, or in fact responding to a certain anxiety that he has, certainly as far as his social class is concerned. So where was I going with this? That I think that the issue of social class is absolutely just deeply embedded into all of these questions, and this goes back to Bella's question about multiple publics too. I think in thinking about reading in Russia, we often sort of get, this is the way reading was for the newly literate peasantry versus this is the way reading was for the educated elites, and other sort of small groups that we divide the populations into in order to sort of try to form a mosaic of a sense of how things generally were, when in fact the reality is much more complicated, and it's just sort of, well, it's difficult, if not impossible, to sort of describe everything exactly as it was. Sorry, one more thing. You used the word paternalistic dynamic, and that's exactly what I have been looking for in trying to describe the attitudes of these various writers. So thank you very much for that. And yeah, I think I'll stop there at the moment, if that's all right. Thank you again so much for your comments.
Okay, and we have a question from Kate Antonovich. I wonder if you could expand on the concept of readers in your work. Are they children or adults? Tolstoy groups the reading material by age, so it is clear that he was attuned to the impact of age differences. I'm curious if in your research you saw discussions on how to approach different groups of readers. Did people see teaching adults as different to teaching children, or was the overall pedagogical goals and approach thought to be the same?
This is a great question. So I would say that in general, so what we see among Karanzin, Belinsky, I'll stop there, Karanzin and Belinsky, is both of them are commenting on the way that education fails Russians before they come of age. They go to school for however many years, and they learn not a lot of stuff, and then they go out into the world. And I suppose Tolstoy has a bit of that as well, except he then becomes very invested in this question of how do we educate the children. So I think what is sort of constant throughout pretty much all really of the writings that I've seen about educating children in Russia from really the late 18th century to the revolution is that this isn't working right and we need to fix it somehow. Now, whether that differs from the ways that these people thought about educating adults, I think the short answer would be yes. But I also don't necessarily know that they, okay, Tolstoy is kind of an exception here. in as much as he's very invested in sort of the natural goodness of the child and before the child is sort of corrupted by outside influences and whatnot. But I don't think that I have necessarily even seen Karanzin and Belinsky talk very explicitly about educating children in particular. I think their comments have more to do with what sort of good literary habits can be developed in adults who have already gone through this education that didn't do all that much for them, but now we're sort of tasked with continuing their education in a way that's not possible in the schools and guide them through their journeys in literature. As far as Tolstoy goes, again, I think he's probably the only one among these people who gave a lot of thought to the differences between age groups, essentially. And as you point out, or I suppose as I pointed out, Tolstoy does group his reading material by age. So yes, I think he is cognizant of and has spent a lot of time thinking about the stages of life to which various texts correspond more or less well.
This is really kind of at a much lower level. But Brian, I was wondering if you were aware of these local libraries, because I've come across them, especially in the late 19th century, and they keep track of not who's reading what, but what's being read in their libraries. And so it seems to me, since so much of that stuff is published, it would be an interesting source for you to read, because it seems as though whoever's in charge of this stuff, whether it's the Free Economic Society sending literature to the countryside about all sorts of things, they're always unhappy with what people actually choose to read. And it's astonishing because it doesn't seem to really matter. So, they criticize peasants for only wanting to read religious literature. And then the agronomists are trying to get them to read about scientific agronomy. Well, no, they don't want to read that either, and it's this, as you said, the term paternalistic is very much present, I think, in all of this. But I think there's some actual written sources that might help you in the future, at least, to see this beyond just the literature people know. I understand that that's probably not what you're about, but if you decide to pursue that, that would be an interesting place to look. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yes, I am aware of the many tables into which I have been a little bit scared to dive, but I think that would be, in fact, a very logical place to go, digging for some more concrete information about this. And I think it is also really interesting that, as you point out, nobody is ever satisfied with what people are actually reading. It's, they make all these statements about what you should be reading and what are your works and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, there is no, I'm not sure I can even imagine what would satisfy these people short of, an exact replica of the list of reading recommendations that I put on the slides. So yeah, it's again, it's a notion of different publics, and I think different gatekeepers too. And that each of these individual critics and gatekeepers are also going to have different ideas about what constitutes good reading material, depending on the day, depending on where they are, etc.
Okay, and I think that's it. Unless anybody has any more questions. There's a lot of comments in the chat. I can send the transcript to you, Brian.
Thank you.
If you'd like to read through those later.
Well, that's great. If there are no more questions, then thank you again, Brian, for the wonderful talk. And thanks to everyone for coming. And thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Anne. And we'll see you again, I hope, in 2 weeks for our last summer talk. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. This was wonderful.